So this all happened when I was about 12. I was, and still am currently living in the suburbs of Alaska. Around where I lived, there wasn't many people, so if you were to scream, it's unlikely anyone would ever hear you. I was in a ditch that was near my neighborhood. I had just gotten home and my older brother wasn't due to get home until an hour later. When I was in the ditch, I was playing when my attention came to a pair of large footprints. Like any other curious 12-year-old would do, they led me deeper into the ditch, where there was a large curve that separated from civilization. After a while, I saw moose prints. I followed those for a bit, but then I saw fresh wolf or dog prints. I knew they were fresh because the prints were still a bit wet. I looked forwards and into the woods a bit. After a moment, I saw two figures move quickly. At first, I thought it was two rabbits, until I remembered the dog prints and realized the two figures were too big to be rabbits. A bit unsettled, but still curiosity filled me, I climbed out of the ditch so I could get a better view. I was looking intently into the woods when I saw something moving in my direction. This made me step a few feet back, instantly regretting it because of what I had learned in school of what to do if an animal approached me, and the fact that I couldn't see the animal anymore. At this point, I was slowly taking steps backwards so I could get closer to my home, when something caught my eye. I saw another dog to my left. At this point, I said screw it and turned around and walked faster towards home. It took a while, and I couldn't exactly run, as the snow was up to my knees, and it was also at the stage of starting to melt, but being incredibly damp and heavy. After about 10 minutes of walking, I made it home in one piece. I consider myself lucky that the wolves didn't attack me, because if they did, I would have been dead meat before anyone realized I was even gone. To give a little context here, for most of my life, I have endeavored to be as rational and scientific as possible, and thus have been skeptical about the supernatural. Then, a few years ago, I'm 33 now, I came to the realization that I cannot intellectually claim any certitude about whether or not supernatural entities exist, but emotionally, I believe in something. It was a hard thing to come to terms with, actually. I think I had a bit of cognitive dissonance. Rationally, these things do not exist, but I still believe that they do, if that makes any sort of sense. My personal encounters with the ghosts are pretty mild. When I was very young, a door slammed in the basement in a room where my sister, cousin, best friend, and I were playing. We paused, looked at each other with terror-stricken faces, then clamored over each other trying to run upstairs as fast as we could. We all remembered that encounter to this day. Another time, I walked downstairs and saw my deceased grandfather's old rocking chair rocking back and forth. Now, this thing was really heavy. And I mean, like, it's a rocking chair built from industrial purposes. It had thick, heavy wood, and it was rocking back and forth at a full swing. There was no one else in the basement, so I thought that perhaps the cat could be sleeping on it, jumped off, and was hiding somewhere. After all, she did sleep there on occasion. A few months later, I saw my cat jump off the thing. She was on the very edge of the seat, which I imagine would create the most leverage for rocking. It did not budge an inch. But the story I really wanted to tell you happened to me one day to my friend's dad. Let's call him Vance. Vance is the quintessential outdoorsman. I would be hard-pressed to choose between him or Les Stroud if I ever got lost in the woods, and got to choose someone to be lost with me. He is a special needs teacher. Suffice to say, one of the nicest human beings that I've ever had the pleasure of knowing, and I have never known him to lie or even exaggerate. He told the story just like he told his funny stories. He laughed through the whole thing as if he couldn't believe it happened to him. Anyway, in his younger years, he and one of his friends took a job for the Canadian government, where they had to catalog an old ferry wreck in the lake in British Columbia somewhere. Apparently, sometime in the late 1800s, I know, nice and vague, it had sunk and had a bunch of passengers on it that died or something along those lines. I would imagine it was sometime during the gold rush when ramshackle businesses popped out of nowhere. I cannot remember exactly, but I think he said it was Pigeon Lake, not the one in Alberta, but I could be wrong. I did some lazy research and have found that a lake called Pigeon Lake exists in British Columbia, and that's about all. No one seems to live on the lake today, from my satellite views of Google Earth anyway, but there is another lake near it that seems to be a camping spot. I have also failed to find any information regarding a wreck at that point in the time in that area. Anyway, Vance and his friend, who are both certified divers, are driven and boated to the middle of the lake. They were the only ones, as it was secluded and seems to be to this day. The water is a bit murky, but they have flashlights and an alright view of things. They dive down. It may have been so deep that they had to acclimate as not to get bends, but I probably just added that to myself over time. Either way, just as they got their first glimpse of the wreck, like something out of a horror film, a fucking dude swims out of the scariest fuck depths, rips the breathing nozzle out of Vance's mouth, takes a breath and swims away. Both guys see this and feel this. Vance puts his breathing apparatus back in. Obviously, they look at each other and they're like, what the hell? And then head for the surface. Initially, their minds went to semi-rational places and they thought someone had come out in another boat. So, they came up, all concerned for this guy who was diving to dangerous depths. I do believe they actually went back down to Carlog-le-Rac without further incident, because Vance is hardcore like that. Anyway, that story always scared the bejesus out of me. It would freak me out to see a ghost, never mind one at the bottom of a lake. So this story happened to my best friend, who for safety's sake, I plan to call A for now. A and her boyfriend were sitting outside in a truck with another friend. While they were high, none of us had ever seen anything like this before. A saw something moving around outside of the truck and went to brush it off, and so one of the others asked if we had all seen it as well. According to them, it looked like a dog, but had red eyes and the head of a jackal, and seemed to be on its legs. Its back 2 legs, that was. It was moving too fast for a normal dog. It was moving faster than its legs, it seemed. It disappeared for a moment before reappearing on the porch of the friend they were waiting on, Kay, and it appeared to be eating something. A called Kay and told her they were leaving, to which Kay replied, "That was any of you guys in the house?" A then said she looked towards the porch and saw her door was wide open. I've been to Kay's house before and it's not easy to get that door open, so they aren't sure how it happened. Even I got a bad feeling about hearing this. After I got a call late from A asking if I knew anything about demons, since we were both Wiccans. A went back to Kay's house the next day and said that things looked normal, but she could tell things just felt super off. In the fall of 2016, a friend and I decided to go hiking late in the afternoon in a densely wooded wilderness area in the mountains, not far from Fayetteville, Arkansas. My friend Rick was close to 60 at the time and recovering from a triple bypass he had undergone around 16 months earlier. We had been hiking these trails for about a year following his operation to strengthen his cardiovascular health. That day, a weekday, I hiked with a bottle of water, my wallet, and my keys, but nothing else. Nothing to protect myself. The trail we picked is a popular weekend hiking spot that we had taken dozens of times before. We were both comfortable with the hike and had never had a problem on that path, or any other for that matter. While Rick is older, and at the time a little more feeble after his health problems, I was in my mid-40s, well over 6 feet tall, and in pretty good shape. So, I wasn't really very worried about our safety. The trail we were on is on a state park adjacent to federal park land. It's an outdoors enthusiast's dream. Most of our trek that day was completely uneventful. We just enjoyed the autumn leaves and chatted casually as the sun dropped lower in the evening sky. We had seen nobody else that day, which was probably to be expected given that we chose to hike late on a weekday. We'd completed about 4 miles of the 6-mile loop up to that point, and it was as uneventful as any other. On our way back to the car, and about 2 miles from park area, we spotted someone. Through an opening in the trees, I saw a young woman, probably a college student. She was on the trail ahead of us, and moving in our direction. At first glance, I paid her very little attention, as the distance between us disappeared. That changed. I did not know her, so I could not have mistaken, but there was something about her posture and expression that just seemed off. As she got closer, it struck me that she had some semi-panicked look on her face and was moving quite quickly. But she was in athletic gear, so maybe she was just doing some cardio or something. She occasionally turned her head and stared over her shoulder. I followed her eyes and eventually noted that another woman about 50 yards behind her was walking up the path through the trees. The second woman was not wearing hiking gear. In fact, her clothing struck me as totally inappropriate. It was a warm afternoon, and we were all, well, inside a wooded state park area for miles away from any homes, but she was wearing semi-formal, offish casual attire and a light jacket. I thought the clothes must have been secondhand because they were tattered and ill-fitting, and they definitely didn't look washed. She was a fit, athletic-looking woman who couldn't have been more than 25 or 30 years of age. It was too bizarre. The clothes were wrong for the trail, and they were wrong for the age. Everything about her was off. Her shoes struck me as being even more peculiar. When she got closer, I noticed she was wearing scuffed, leather flats, casual shoes with no ankle support. I found it completely odd, because you just don't see people on this trail just as she was, and you never see them wearing shoes like that. My hiking partner, Rick, hadn't appeared to notice anything odd, as he was completely involved in the conversation and just kept talking. The second woman briefly glanced up, and we made eye contact as she neared us. The alarm bells were going off in my head. There was something in her eyes that made me feel uncomfortable. I don't know what she was thinking, if I'm being honest, but I swear she had contempt in her face. Part of me wondered whether I'd be offending her by staring, so I diverted my eyes and kept walking. I tried to tell myself that maybe she was homeless. Maybe she was wearing the only thing she had, and I was just being rude. But the warning bells were still going off in my head. I'm not a paranoid person, so having my sixth sense going off like that was very unsettling. I have a fantastic peripheral vision, so I turned my face toward Rick and acted like I was listening to him, but I was watching the creepy woman at the corner of my eye. The moment we passed, she spun her head around to study us, and she slowed her pace. My internal alarms grew louder. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her come to a stop and drop her face toward the ground, her body half turned on the trail. It was very odd behavior. Rick and I kept walking around 50 yards further. We made it around a bend in the path, and I looked back at the woman before the trees obscured her view. She was still standing there. Her face was down, but she was staring a hole through us out of the corner of her eyes. That was the first time I realized that I couldn't see her hands. One was inside her jacket pocket, and the other was hidden from my view on the other side of her body. It creeped the hell out of me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. For half a mile, I didn't see her again, and had begun to wonder whether the first woman, the co-ed, had felt danger as well. Clearly she had, I thought, and that's why she was practically running through the woods at dusk. It also struck me that the woman was stopping and studying Rick and me, like she was deciding on whom to follow. We weren't moving as fast, we were walking as quickly as Rick could manage, and he was clearly more feeble than a co-ed. But those thoughts and my senses and I felt very uneasy, so I periodically checked behind us. At certain points through the woods, I could see more than 100 yards, and nothing. I began to worry about the co-ed. My hair stood up for a second time as I felt the strongest sensation of being watched. Again, thinking I was paranoid and half mocking myself for being afraid of the creepy woman, I turned my head around to assure myself she was not back there. I was wrong. She was there, following with her head down and moving briskly about 100 yards behind us, but with her hands hidden. I turned my head back to the trail in front of us and kept walking, still trying to convince myself that there was nothing out of the ordinary happening, that I was just being rude because she was dressed like a homeless woman. About 200 yards further along the path, I turned my head back to Rick, and my heart raced a bit. She had closed half the distance. Each time we walk around a bend in the woods obscured her location, she would emerge closer and closer to us. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, but nevertheless, I tried to get Rick to pick up the pace. By this time, he was clearly aware that we were being followed, and he was pretty uncomfortable as well. Though, to his credit, he did keep walking. With half a mile to go before we reached the parking area, I turned my head once again, and she was just 10 feet behind us. I hadn't seen or heard her get that close, and it freaked me out. I literally jumped. One of her hands was in her pockets, and the other was behind her back. I got the distinct feeling she had a weapon of some kind, and that she had no fear of, despite the fact that I was considerably taller, albeit several years older. There was no mistaking her demeanor. She meant to do us harm, or at the very least she intended to intimidate us. I weaved my car keys between my knuckles. I handed my water bottle to Rick, and made an obvious fist with my left hand. With a half mile left in her hike, I thought to myself, if this is nothing, she'll pass us and move on, as clearly she's moving a lot faster than we are. I was accustomed to people overtaking us, but she didn't pass, and never acted like she knew we were there, which was the creepiest part. I kept my head turned to her as I walked and tried to get her to make eye contact, but she didn't look me in the eyes at first. She kept acting like neither Rick nor I were on the path a few feet ahead of her, and she'd followed so closely behind. I was completely unnerved, and that made me angry. I wanted her to see how pissed I was and to convey with a look that messing with me was a mistake. When she finally did make eye contact with me, I glared and clenched my fist. There was an instant where I couldn't read her expression. She was simply blank, but as she studied my face, she appeared simultaneously agitated and a little less confident. I was conveying, one thing on my face, back the fuck off. And at this point, I didn't give a damn if it appeared rude. She apparently thought better of whatever she was doing and slowed her pace so that the distance between us grew to about 20 feet. But she was tense and kept whatever she had in her hand hidden behind her. I never saw her hands. I knew she had a weapon though, and I believe she meant to do us harm. But I also know she recognized that I was ready to fight. I was mentally prepared to charge at her if I saw a gun or a knife, as I knew Rick couldn't outrun her. I thought to myself, I just have to surprise her. I also realized that I needed to have her in front of us. A few hundred feet further, about a quarter mile away from where our car was parked, she still was stalking us, and I had enough. I was in equal measures afraid and furious. I told Rick that we were going to stop and let her pass, loud enough for her to hear it. Just as I was getting ready to stop on the trail and make her walk in front of us, she veered into a small clearing, plowing through waist-high brush, crossed a ditch and scurried through a tree line to a road that ran through the woods in between the main road and the parking area. I kept my eyes on her the entire time. She had a car. It was parked alongside the little service road, partially hidden by shrubs, not in the parking lot. The last time we made eye contact just before she climbed in her car, it was clear from the expression on her face that she was very angry. I glared at her, expressing my own anger, and kept walking. When her car started and she drove away, Rick got quiet before asking me, "What in the hell was she doing? Did she have a gun?" I told him I didn't know. I never saw a weapon. We walked back to our car without saying another word. Once the engine was on and the doors were shut, we chatted a bit more and decided to call the authorities and report the incident, and to make sure to have them check the poor co-ed who had passed first. To this day, I have no idea what the creepy woman was planning to do. I don't know if she wanted to rob us, harm us, scare us, I have no idea. I'm just thankful she decided better of it. I have hiked that trail more than 50 times since then, but I've never seen her again. This story happened when I was about 9. I was hiking down a trail with my family. It was my mother, father, my older brothers Bobrov and Roman, and our dog Charger. We were heading down a mountain after a day of hiking in a nice Siberian summer. I want to say it was mid-July, so it was actually fairly nice out. A fun little break from 8 months of winter in the following mud season. We were walking down, and the sun was setting quickly that day, so we were about 2 miles from the bottom before it got dark, and so we started hearing traditional nightlife start to pop up, such as owls and the like. Nothing too unusual. What struck me as odd, though, was my mother was an old-school Slavic pagan Mansi tribal member, so she was really into the supernatural scene, and she started getting freaked out. She kept saying something was behind us, and then she just kept saying Almas or Almasty, which means wild people. And my dad was a soldier in the Spetsnaz. He fought in Chechnya, so he was very aware and always kept a gun on him. Initially, he just brushed it off as my mom got scared of the dark, so he held her hand and kept her close, trying to quiet her so she wouldn't worry us. Then, after 20 minutes more, my father just stopped and we all instinctively stopped as well. My father turned to the left, looking up a slight slope, and said, "We are being watched. Get behind me now." So naturally, my brother Roman and I get behind him with my mother, and Bobrov stands beside my father. He was 15 and the oldest and bravest. My father hands him a small pistol. I think it was a Makarov, and pulls out the sidearm that he carried. Our dog Charger became strange and started smelling like crazy, and then I noticed a very powerful smell, almost like a wet garbage or dumpster juice, just very foul and offensive to the senses. It almost made my eyes want to water. Charger then begins to bark and runs out of sight, up the slope towards the Sinky source. My father, in an unusually cold but commanding manner, demanded, "Charger, back now." Charger comes out of the bush and looks at us before taking another step forward. Then we see her get pulled back into the bush. She never yelped or cried, just as she was just gone in a blank. My father, at this point, cycled his pistol and held it up ready to fire and commanded, "We move as a group down the hill now." So we did, and my father, covering up our backs for the whole rest of the way down. We got down safely. I really wish the story ended here, but whatever it was, followed us home. About 2 nights passed and we are sleeping in our small house. It was essentially a kitchen attached to one big bedroom, like a small old-fashioned log cabin. We were located at the far end of our village, about 500 yards from the nearest house, so a little bit isolated, but not extremely. There were woods all around our house as well. I slept beneath the very small turning window. It was a window that was on a rotating stick in the center, and you could just kind of get a fresh breeze in, but it wasn't very large and it was about 2 feet above my head. I was sleeping next to my little sister, and then it was Roman, Bobrov, and then my parents, all in the same room but separate cots. It was crowded, but I liked having them so close. Turns out that maybe was saved me. It was early in the morning, 2 or 3, and I swear in my sleep, I heard a small creak similar to the one this window made when you opened it. I freaking hated that the window. It always annoyed me. I heard the small creak, and I felt something almost gently tug on my hair, on the front bangs on my face. I had kind of a mullet when I was younger. I began to wake up and sat up slightly, thinking Praz Bob Rob was screwing with me, like he typically would in the early morning. Before I could think of anything else, I felt a large, violent, and very strong big hand grab my whole face. 2 digits were beneath my jaw, so I couldn't even open my mouth to scream. This hand was so large I couldn't see anything in front of me, only my peripheral vision. This strong hand pulled me from my bed and towards the windows, as it was trying to drag me outside. I cried a loud, muffled scream as I kicked violently and tried hitting this thing in the arm, whatever was holding me. My brother Barbara held to me by the wrist, and my brother Roman held me by my legs as my sister screamed. I could hear my mother, being frantic as my father, raced out of the house. I could barely breathe, and the foul odor of this monster was filling my lungs. I think I could hear it grunting, but it was hard to tell between the frantic yelling and screaming. Finally, 2 gunshots break the commotion. The hand drops me to the floor, and I immediately get surrounded by my family. Only hear it. The loudest deep roar of pain and anger that terrifies me to this day. It was long and loud. It seemed to almost shake the very house. My father gave chase to this beast before it escaped into the woods. My father told us he had hit this creature twice, but it still ran faster than he could have predicted, and covered such a distance in a short span of time that it was difficult to hit it in the darkness. He later described it in detail to me. He said it was very broad in the shoulders and walked like a man, but had much more weight to its steps. He described his face as very flat and heavily defined, with a brow ridge and large eyes for nocturnal predators, almost like an owl. Had thick brown, very coarse hair that covered his whole body, except for the face, kneecaps, and hands. It seemed to stand roughly about 7.5 feet tall and had about 400 pounds of defined muscle to it. My father was a soldier and he had served 4 active combat tours. He was 6'8", and this was the only time I remember seeing him in fear. This changed my father profoundly. He became a little less sure of himself and began hanging out with his old army buddies a lot more. Needless to say, all I know is that I was terrified beyond anything, and I don't know what that was. This happened a couple years ago, and I still remember it clearly as if it really creeped me out. I grew up in a very strict home. My dad is a preacher and my mom is a workaholic. So you can imagine what I went through in my teen years, as I was very rebellious. I was into gangs, drugs, and that sort of thing. I had just gotten out of a 9-month county jail stay and had 6 months in boot camp. So I was very excited to smoke some weed. However, I was still on probation, but I had heard about synthetic weed and it was popular and easily available. This was music to my ears. Weed that can't be detected signed me up. Man, how I wish I had known the roller coaster was going to cause my life. Anyway, so if you smoke synthetic weed, you know it fucks you up pretty bad. My parents started catching on, and soon I had to hide to get high. This was easy, because there's a very deep forest behind my house. I would jump the fence and walk until I found a place to sit down and smoke. After about 2 months of this routine, I was walking the trail that takes me to my favorite spot, when suddenly, I heard something from behind me. As I turned around, I noticed that there was a man a couple of yards away, walking in the same direction as me. I looked at him and tried not to show any sign that I had been startled by his sudden appearance. This man was tall and looked pretty worn out. He had crappy clothes and looked like he had come from a homeless shelter or something. There was something very creepy about how he walked. The stare he had was very disturbing. It felt like he was watching my every move. I could feel his fierce stare even while he was behind me. I turned to look at him and he didn't even blink, just stared. I nodded in respect and kept walking. I had just finished boot camp, so I was ready to defend myself. I am also very paranoid. I couldn't stand the fact that the stranger was behind me, so I turned around to look at him. He asked, "Are you okay?" In a mocking kind of tone, probably sensing my discomfort. I said, "Yeah." Awkward. I noticed that even if I slowed down walking, he was making sure he stayed behind me. I even stepped off the side, then pretended to text to watch him pass by, and he walked even slower, in a very obvious way. He just kept staring with an evil look in his eye, kind of like annoyed that I would even try to outsmart him. He was expecting me to run. He kept following me and staring at me. I probably should have turned around but I just was too scared and I just didn't know what the hell this guy was doing. What really bothered me was that he had his sleeves rolled up and was getting closer like he was planning to do something. I played a very desperate move. I stopped in my tracks and said very loud, "Did you hear that?" I pulled out my butterfly knife and started into the woods to our side. He suddenly stopped and we both stood there in silence, just waiting there. I turned to face him, motioning him to be quiet. Act like I heard an animal or something. I shrugged it off and said, probably a pig or something." I kept the knife open in my hand like that as I walked. Because all of this stalling and walking in the pretty deep woods now, I couldn't afford to turn back now. I noticed he was keeping his distance, still staring at me with a very mean look. Then he was gone. I was so creeped out that I walked with the knife and just kept checking behind me. Finally, I felt pretty safe. However, I was a bit too far into the woods that I knew if I smoked that synthetic weed, I'd have to go all the way back really high. At least it was still daylight because, trust me, I smoked back there at night. I know, how stupid. Anyway, I decided to take the main trail that ejects you into the far end of the neighborhood. All the other trails end up who knows where. I knew about a clearing where I was gonna smoke, then walk back to my house, through the neighborhood to play it safe. As I approached the clearing, my stomach dropped. One of the trunks was the man sitting there. What the fuck? How did he beat me here? But the thing that really bothered me was that he had something like a pickaxe or an axe. He was just sitting there. I watched him to see if he was chopping a tree or something. Nope, just talking to himself, rocking back and forth like a crazy person. I watched him trying to figure him out. He hadn't seen me, so I was very quiet. My knife was no match for that weapon that he had. I'd have to fight him. As all this was going through my head, he got up, grabbed an axe, and walked in my direction. I don't think he heard me. I just think it was bad timing. Fuck this shit. I took off running, and not once did I look back. Once I left the trail, went to the woods to jump my house, I ran through those woods cutting and scraping my arms and face on the way and just not caring. That incident spooked me so much that I did not go back until about 3 months later. And I always carried something more effective than a knife, if you know what I mean. Before I start this story, let me give you a little insight on myself. I grew up in a very military strict family. From the moment I turned 5, my dad taught me everything I know now, from fighting to survival skills. My dad being an ex-Navy SEAL, nothing really scares me. I'm not trying to paint myself as the most fearless person in the world, but I am also a paranormal investigator. Not something I talk about at work, but after having my fair share of experiences, I grew to love it, and it always interested me. So, from putting away some of the worst people in the world and my fair share of seeing the creepiest shit, Nothing honestly scares me. This story takes place several summers ago. Two of my friends, Craig and Justin also being in law enforcement, and the other a firefighter, decided to go camping. I always felt so comfortable in the woods. As I said, my dad taught me everything I know. We would spend days in the woods just living off the land. My friend knew of a very remote area up in New Hampshire. I don't recall the location. I was actually really excited because I hadn't been camping in years. It took us some time to find a good spot to get a good idea of the area. I felt like we were in another planet entirely. We set up our tents, gathered up some firewood, and all of us had brought MREs to eat. We sat around talking for what felt like hours. We all grew pretty tired and decided to head to bed. I settled into my tent and quickly passed out. I was awoken by probably 3 a.m. to this horrible feeling. The only way to explain it is the need to fight, or I was about to die. Now, I always carry a gun on me, my Beretta 92S. It really never leaves my side. I sat up and looked around my tent. It was small enough that there wasn't much space. Here's the creepy part. I remember my father used to tell me to listen to the woods, the animals and night crawlers. They will go silent if something's wrong. You won't hear a single thing. And that's it. I heard nothing. The first time in my life I felt fear. I have had my fair share of demonic hauntings, and this doesn't even come close. I peered out of the tent. We had set the tent up on a good elevation facing an open field, about 100 yards or so away. Mind you, it was full moon and bright as heck. Something was standing there. I can only begin to describe this thing as a mammal, half a lizard thing. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like half of the body of a horse. It had a lizard-like face, and what I can only describe as spikes coming from the back and one hell of a set of teeth. At first, I seriously thought someone was in a costume messing with us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting from this thing, an unearthly one. I did notice it was looking at something. I couldn't make out what kind of animal it was, but it was probably the size of a raccoon. It looked like it was trying to sneak by, but the animal just randomly fell on its side and just let this thing take it. I was absolutely terrified. I knew if this thing headed our way, no 9mm is going to do anything to it. I could even hear it breathing all the way from my tent. What only sounds like something breathing through pudding. I crawled to my friend's tent, keeping a low profile. In a small relief, I noticed my friend Craig was also awake. He was looking at the same thing I was. We waited as the thing just stood there looking around. Then, it started to make its way for the tree lines. We could hear it smashing through the trees, and then silence. Craig and I just laid there for what felt like hours until the sun came up. Still, absolutely terrified. Justin woke up. Of course, he heard nothing and not believing a single word of what we said. We packed up that day, and I have never been back to those woods. I seriously was always afraid to tell this story. I'll probably be sent for a psych evaluation, and I don't care, because I am not making this crap up. I'm a 17-year-old male, living in the Midwest. My sophomore year of high school, my friends peer pressured me into joining the track team. I thought that this was a good idea, because I wanted to improve my stamina. So, due to this fact, I was asked to join the long-distance track team. To practice, our small team would run in the woods and then to a lake. These woods are mostly used for off-road biking, so we would run in the forest in the dirt paths that the bikes would make. After school, we would run in these woods every day. Time to time, we saw deer. These deer would get very close, so much so that one would only need to take 3 or 4 feet to maybe even pet one. These woods were fun to run in because they could be so secluded. The last day I ran in these woods, it was just another day. Due to my poor stamina, I was pretty far behind the rest of the group, and I had produced a fairly painful side cramp. In fact, I stopped to take a breather. Let me give you a layout of the path I was on. The bike path is cut into a slope, dividing it into two parts. The upper half is surrounded in trees, and above that is just more woods. The other half of the slope leads to ponds and more woods. As I was admiring the nature, I heard a loud snap high up in the woods. In so many scary stories, people say they get that feeling, where they feel dread or the hair on their neck stands up. This feeling is very real, as I got this feeling. Turning around, I expected to see deer, yet, to my utter horror, I saw a man. The man was pretty far away, but I saw his jeans and long-sleeved checkered shirt. A bit of background on myself. I am currently a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo, going on 15 years of practicing martial arts. Still, with my knowledge of self-defense, I was put off and began a light jog. To my utter horror, the man began to sprint down the hill. The creepiest part of his sudden sprint was how he used the trees to propel himself. I suddenly realized why he was running. He was trying to cut me off. Realizing I could not outrun him, I said a silent prayer as I ripped off an old stick of a fallen tree. The man finally made it down the hill. I was face to face with what I believed was a homeless man. The smell was very pungent. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had unkempt beard. I warned him to fuck off, and I raised the stick. The man smiled and said words I will never forget. All I want to do is play. At this comment, I closed the distance, delivering a kick into his groin. He moaned and began to stumble. I brought down the stick as hard as I could, breaking it over his head. The man fell on the path. With utter fear in my heart, I ran as hard and as fast as I could. My coach was waiting for me at the end of the forest path. She could see that I looked fearful and asked me what was wrong. I smiled weakly and told her nothing. Then I decided not to tell my coach anything, because I didn't think she'd believe me. After a few days, I decided to tell my parents, who immediately told me to tell my coach. I told her the next practice, and we did not run in those woods again. To this day, over a year later, I still have decided not to enter those woods. My father used to enjoy going to this campground, not far from the hometown he grew up in. The campground was in Cavendish, Vermont. It was called Catton Place. He enjoyed how peaceful and remote the area was, having been there a few times and observing that it was family friendly. He thought it would be nice to bring his daughter with him. Choosing to go the same time of year that he went the last few times, he saw familiar faces. There was this campsite of 3 men who were out-of-staters in their 40s. Most likely, they were from Boston because of their accents. They had a big fancy trailer, and the entire site was decked out with a dartboard, hammock, lawn chairs, garden gnomes, and patches of fake grass. From observation, it looks like they stayed there a couple of weeks at a time, all settled in and quite comfortable. Too comfortable, actually, to the point that they walked around with a sense of superiority, boastful and loud. They acted like they owned the place. The place was actually run by an elderly couple. These macho-acting goons were quite friendly with them. The year before, they painted the playground for them for free, so the elderly couple loved these guys. My father saw these men around last time, but didn't have to deal with them or worry much because their camp was situated far apart from them. This time, unfortunately, we were placed quite close to them, with only one empty campsite separating us. We were surrounded by other campsites too, but about 30 feet away, there was a middle-aged couple camping out as well. Here is where the story starts. We arrived and set up our camp. I remember observing those men across from us. My father waved a friendly hello to them, and they waved back. Throughout the day, I played on the playground. By nighttime, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. Meanwhile, those macho goons across the way were partying hard. Booze everywhere and blaring tunes on the radio. Lots of laughs and bickering too. We didn't pay much attention or look over that way. We just kept to ourselves. Tired yawns, we crawled into our tents and tried to go to sleep, but all the ruckus was still going on. I was able to fall asleep, but my father was not. He lay there for a few hours and kept checking the time occasionally. It was getting closer to midnight, and you wondered if the middle-aged couple nearby were having trouble sleeping over this noise too. Then, the sound could be heard of a vehicle coming down the road. It was the elderly man who owns the place. He stops and lets the men know there's been a noise complaint. The men apologize profusely and say they'll be settling into their sleep soon. The owner leaves. They immediately start cussing and throwing things around their campsite as the owner was out of sight. They were offended that somebody had reported them. Pretty Thing did it. One of the others asked, "Well, Itchy, the guy and the little girl next to us for the couple over there." The other guy responds. Third guy adds, "I didn't see any of them leave in their car to go to the front desk. So one of these people must have a cell phone." This was 1997 or 1998, so cell phones weren't as common back then. These men began conspiring to figure out who owns the cell phone. They weren't trying hard to speak in a hushed tone because my father could hear everything. "I bet it's the asshole at the Cadillac who owns the cell phone. I'm going over there," one of them said as they're talking about my father. He does not have a cell phone though. The feeling of pure fear came over him. He has no idea what's going to happen and needs to think fast. The sound of stumbling footsteps come right up just inches away from our tent. What to do? What to do? My dad thought of making a noise, any noise, and he grabbed the soda can next to him, flicked the top with his fingers, and this guy started and takes a step backwards. He then scurries away back to his drunk buddies. They are now whispering amongst themselves. He can't pick up on what they're saying, but catches the part where they're saying that they're going to try again later. He wonders if he heard that right. What the hell are these guys trying to do? There's no way my father is going to try to fall asleep now. In fact, he's not feeling tired at all. Hopped up on so much adrenaline right now from the fear. Man, with his daughter, feeling helpless. Only a soda can and a flashlight to protect us. My dad lays there frozen, listening, listening, listening. Hoping these guys would just give it up and just sleep off their drunk craziness. A short time passes and they hear the footsteps again. Their campfire is so bright that it casts a shadow into our tent. He can literally see the shadow of the man coming towards us. The man doesn't get as close as this time because, again, he stops at the noise coming from our tent. My dad had unzipped his sleeping bag in a panic, ready to defend and protect us, just in case the man was going to try to come in our tent. The man is not moving anymore. He's just standing there watching us. My dad remembered he had a lighter in his pocket, so he took it out and from underneath the blanket flipped the switch on. He was just hoping it would mimic the sound of a gun getting ready. I don't think it worked. But the man eventually did turn around and go back to his campsite. You won't believe this. They're still awake? What the fuck? They all sputtered against themselves. Maybe, just maybe, being around 2:30 a.m. now, they will finally go to sleep. Nope. At this point, I'm still sleeping. But I'm tossing and turning a lot. My feet slap against the side of the tent, and a couple of times, and the footsteps are approaching us again. While I brush my feet against the side of the tent, the man says, with an exasperated sigh. He starts to walk away, but not to his campsite. He walks towards the road, walks a few feet, stops, and screams at the top of his lung. If I find out who reported us, I will kill you. You hear me? I will fucking kill you. Everything is still now. Only sounds that could be heard is the crackling of the campfire and the occasional indistinct chatter amongst the men. Then, finally, the sound of their trailer door shutting at 5 a.m. They're asleep. My dad lays there trying to process everything that has happened. At 6 a.m., he wakes me up to pack up and get out of there. I remember him rushing me, and I was a little confused. My dad then said he's never going camping again, and that statement is still true. He's never been camping since. When I was young, I was one of those kids who wished all about being outdoors. I was in the Boy Scouts as soon as I was old enough to join, and stayed in until I was 18. In Boy Scouts, there is a group called the Order of the Arrow, or OA. To my young mind, it was like the Special Forces of Scouting, and I was so excited when I was told I had been selected to join their prestigious ranks. So, I packed my bags and went to Camp Dat Dale, Restler, New Mexico. And I was ready to see what I would have to do to become an OA. To join OA, you have to go through a trial weekend. I would say not much more of that because the trials that we had to go through are secret. The last night though, we were split up into groups of 4, given map coordinates, a compass, and a bare bone minimum of what we would need and told to survive for the night, and then to report to a second set of coordinates in the morning. Myself and the 3 scouts started on our way, and we were hiking for about 5 hours before we found a small clearing and confirmed it was our camping spot. From the northeast to the east there was a thick thorny bramble. We tried to find a way to explore it, but the waist-high vines were impossible to get through without something to cut them. So we ignored it and went on just exploring a bit around the camp and goofing off. As night came, we all started to set down and to make a fire. This would be our only source of light for the night. We stayed up for a bit after dark, chatting and telling stupid jokes, and just having fun, talking before we went to bed. We had one small tent, and so myself and one of the other scouts slept outside near the fire, while the other 2 slept inside. I don't remember the time, because none of us had packed a watch, but it was well after the fire had gone out. I was shaken awake by one of the other scouts. He whispered in a quiet voice that would sometimes crack with fear. There's someone outside our campsite. He then pointed up. Moving from north to east outside the clearing was a bright blue ball of light. The odd thing was, the core was bright, but did not seem to cast a light on the trees. It was more like glowing than producing light per se. I stared at it, nervously and curious, as he quietly belly crawled and woke the other 2 up. "It is just some other group messing around," one of the other scouts said as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, not trying to be quiet like the first one or I had. The light didn't seem to do anything different from its motions as the 4th scout said, "But wait, that is where the bramble is." It was then that we realized how smooth the light was moving, and how dead quiet the forest around us was. Nothing was making a noise, and not even the moving light. I watched it for some time before accidentally falling asleep again. When I woke up, everyone else was already packing to make it to the rendezvous point. They said that whatever it was last night made them feel scared, and I was the only one to sleep after seeing it. The rest had remade the fire before it faded away, and they stayed up on watch. Sadly, this is where the excitement of the story ends. We packed up and made it to the point without incidents.